Hi, and welcome to the Future Homes podcast. My name is Chris Gaze, and this is where we look closely at the ideas, policies, and practical challenges shaping how homes are being designed, built, and delivered in the UK today. Through short, focused conversations with experts from across the home building ecosystem, we unpack what's changing, why it matters, and what it means in practice for developers, consultants, local authorities, and the wider supply chain. We'll be making regular pleas for you to like, subscribe, and share. Sorry in advance if that gets repetitive, but it's important to us, particularly as a new podcast. Please share this episode to help us hit the ground running. Our focus this time is all about Biodiversity Net Gain, which has been a real challenge to many. Our guests are Becky Moberley from the Planning Advisory Service and Paul Dodd, Head of Design Advice at Urban Design Learning. I kick this chat off by asking Becky, why does BNG matter?
There are several answers to that one, but I think the key one really is because we're in a biodiversity crisis. You know, there's been nature conservation policy and legislation around for a long time, and in the end, it hasn't worked to stop that crisis happening. So as things continue to get worse, actually the UK, which often surprises people, is one of the places in the world that is most deprived in terms of its biodiversity. So it's a particularly important in the UK. So yeah, it's just really around that sort of wider context around the biodiversity we've lost already and how do we address that. But I think there's a couple of other answers as well. I mean, one of them you could say is just you've got to do it because it's required and it's been required for 2 years. Another one is just the wider benefits that biodiversity brings. It's as simple actually as just even things like looking at a tree from your hospital window can make a difference to how quickly you recover. There's so much more evidence now around, you know, how green stuff and nature makes a difference to us, both in terms of mental and physical health. But, you know, there's all sorts of other benefits around, you know, air quality, etc. And I think there's just huge amounts of evidence now, particularly on that sort of physical and mental health side of things. And actually, from a developer point of view, it can help bring local communities on board if you demonstrate biodiversity net gain. And it's one of the things that some of the developers who started early on before it was required, they very much came from that perspective, was like, well, if we're concerned about local communities that perhaps don't want housing or something built near to them, we can persuade them by, you know, demonstrating the value that we bring in terms of things like biodiversity net gain.
So we talked about you got to do it. You have got to do it anyway.
Yeah.
So when we look at that, what are the, you know, if you were asked to sort of sum up the policy, what's it mean doing biodiversity net gain? What do we have to achieve?
I mean, basically, you've got to get 10% more biodiversity as part of your development than you had to start with. So you've got to get at least up to where you were before and then another 10%, and that preferably on site, so within the development footprint. But as a second step, you can go off site, so you can look beyond your development site or buy units from a habitat bank. And then there's a last resort is a credit scheme that's run by Natural England. But in the end, you've got to kind of, your balance sheet has got to add up to 110%. So that involves measuring what's on there before you start development, predicting what you're going to have afterwards. The other thing that's really important is that for all off-site biodiversity net gain and for on-site biodiversity net gain that's significant, you have to secure that for 30 years as well. So there's 30 years management and monitoring of that. So yeah, I think that's the basis. I don't know have I missed anything, Paul?
I just had a couple of things actually. We talk about nature and the loss of nature and the challenge we have with that with communities. The moment that MHCLG, they've got their draft consultation out for PPF and for the design and placemaking planning practice guidance. Whether there was a mouthful, but that's a DPPPG. The title's challenging. But what's interesting is in there, the government have set out quite clearly what the 7 features of well-designed places are. One of those elements is nature. The other one of those elements is climate. And when you wrap up with livability, identity, public space, built form, movement, you put all of those together, you consider all of those at the right time, what you get is sustainable development. You get well-designed places. The key thing really is how it's one piece of the pie that delivers something which is livability and good homes and sustainable homes for people.
Yeah, great places to live, and and over the emphasis on place. I'm an engineer. I tend to think about the building, and it's about saying, look, it's far more than that. And we've been on a journey with BNG. I was wondering if you could give us a bit of the background of how we got to where we are, and what sort of things we're looking at in the future.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess if we go way, way back, Biodiversity Net Gain started as a biodiversity no net loss approach. So basically, make sure you have at least as much biodiversity as you started with in the end. So where you're going to impact on biodiversity, you will be creating or enhancing habitats to make sure that you end up your balance sheet at zero. There was a bit of negative feedback about offsetting, and it was seen as a bit of a way to pay to damage, which it wasn't necessarily, but that's sort of how it came. And actually, the private sector then really took it up. So, actually, quite a lot of developers and some local authorities started taking forward, first of all, biodiversity no net loss and then biodiversity net gain. So, you had some local authorities that were doing biodiversity net gain for a long time, and also some developers who had it as part of their approach. And then we get to the stage where it was decided that it should become in as a legal requirement. So in February, what are we now, 2024? And then in terms of where it's going, I mean, I guess we're still learning. There's been various studies that have looked at what was brought in before it became mandatory, and perhaps there's been some, critique around that, perhaps particularly on-site biodiversity net gain and how it's been secured. And we're still very much learning, and that's, as Paul said, that's where this good practice comes in, is around, how can we learn from each other? But we've also got some changes coming imminently, and government has just published a couple of responses to consultations which were out last year, and also a consultation on residential brownfields. So we're looking at some tweaks in terms of the exemptions. And I think what's really good there is just, learning from how it's going. There were some challenges. It's still not, it was a huge change to the way the planning system works and the way things are delivered. And so just learning from that, and particularly for very small sites, it's proving particularly challenging. So one of the big changes that's coming in is an exemption for sites of 0.2 hectares or less in size, and hopefully address that where really those sites are tending to take a lot of time and resource. And so when Paul's talking about local authorities being under-resourced, they take a disproportionate amount of time and resource, and actually for the biodiversity benefits you get, it's not really worth it. So hopefully will mean more time can be spent on the larger sites. But yeah, we're definitely still learning. So as it goes along, even if it's even things that stay as they are, I think we'll get better over time.
Yeah,
and it's not going to be perfect, but it's definitely much, much better than what it was before. And that's what I always say, let's not make perfect the enemy of the good with this, because we do need to, have to learn by doing, really, don't you?
It's incredible that it's just been 2 years,
Yeah.
really, and such a lot of experience and development has taken place in those 2 years. One of the big challenges with local planning authorities was at the early stages of BNG is how do the authority align the regulation, the BND regulations, with planning
Yeah,
process, with
totally.
development management, because it's a regulation. Development management's a slightly different thing around and relating to policy, perhaps in the local plan and so on. And so aligning those two things through what the planning application process, and as you know, Chris, it's quite a complicated process to go through, was a big challenge for local authorities, and they've learned from each other in terms of how they navigate that, how they align resources at different stages of the process, how they train their officers and in understanding of what BNG is, even where they're perhaps not an ecologist or an expert in BNG at all, but rather they're doing a planning function, perhaps it's validation or whatever it might be for the planning application.
It's that balance, I think, between policy and legislation that's really tricky, and we see that in other areas of, for example, nature conservation legislation. It's how do you balance, because you generally, as a planner, for example, you'll look across and weigh up the different aspects. But when you've got a legislative requirement, it's sort of, how does that come in, and how pragmatic can you be? Because in the end, when you're dealing with a particular development site, there's always something different to think about, and how, and it's more tricky to be pragmatic when you've got this sort of legislation. So in some ways it's been really great having that legislative angle, because it's got folk up to the same level and a lot of thinking about it, but sometimes it can face some frustrating constraints. But I think what's really great hearing from the good practice is how it doesn't have to do that. With experience and confidence, you can work. And I think, the big thing we've learned, isn't it, Paul, is around that collaboration, because actually, even with legislation, it doesn't give you yes, no answers. And as planners, you're often making decisions on the margins. It's not a yes or a black and white. It's a, ooh. And I think sometimes people expect BNG to give you a yes, no answer. It doesn't. And ecology doesn't. The natural environment's weird and complicated and mad. You have to work it out. And I think working together is going to be the best way to do that.
And from the local authority side, have they got the capacity to cope with something that's this complicated?
It's a super challenge for local planning authorities. As we know, that the budgets are ever tighter and tighter, that the expertise that is required for BNG is different. It's specific expertise around ecology primarily. We know that is a sector where there are fewer experts, so they are struggling and they are challenged with it. But what they are doing, and what's clear from us, particularly those authorities that are doing really well, they're addressing it. They're dealing with issues around the planning balance, as Becky mentioned, and they're also dealing with a small amount of resource that they need to challenge in the most efficient way to deliver what they're required to deliver through the regulation. And really, it's kind of enabled the green side of planning really to kind of shine, because it's an opportunity to deliver nature recovery, to deliver great, well-designed places.
The Future Home Standard is published. Now it's about implementation. Join us in Leeds on Tuesday the 9th of June or London on Wednesday the 17th of June for the Future Home Standard Technical Conference, a practical event for teams looking at energy assessment, heat pumps, solar panels, fabric, ventilation and overheating, so that you can have homes that not only comply but are great to live in. This is a technical forum, not a policy briefing, and it's designed to help you deliver with confidence. To find out more and book your place, head to the events section on our website or search Future Home Standard Technical Conference online.
I do hope that actually the changes that are coming through may make things a bit easier, just because it will allow that focus on some of the stuff that's perhaps more significant in terms of its importance for biodiversity. So yeah, I mean, and other things as well.
And I know that Paul's been looking at the good stuff. What does the good stuff look like, Paul? I mean, what are the takeaways for both local authorities, but also for developers from the work you've been looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question. What are the key takeaways? We've done 5 reports looking at 5 different areas. We've looked at local plans, good advice in local plans, local policy. We've looked at good practice in monitoring and enforcement and developing habitat bank protocols. We've looked at good practice of LPAs and applicants working together, and we've looked at faster decision making. The key things really are developers need to understand the requirements of BNG for sites at the absolute earliest stages. And this actually will be perhaps even before you've purchased a site. You need to have an understanding of the cost associated with BNG and how you might manage the process. Purchasing, valuing it, and then when you start going down the route of planning, the key learning really is to start early. Get your ecological baseline in as early as possible. Look at what the challenges are. Speak to your local planning authority as early as possible. We always recommend doing performance agreements for planning to start conversations early in terms of pre-apps. We've found that good practice typically involves pre-application processes.
And in that buying process, I mean, you've got 2 things. I mean, what's the state of the land now? I mean, so it could be a brownfield site with really great BNG, but frankly, you're going to do a load of remedial work to it because it may be a great place for the plants, but it's not necessarily a great place for the people to live until you've done the remedial work. Or it could be on a floodplain, and then you have to lift up the site, at which point you presumably will lose loads of BNG, and you'll suddenly find yourself way back from where you need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And BNGs, there's a hierarchy, and if you are looking at developing on land in floodplain that's adjacent to watercourses and wetlands and so on, then you you will be hit very hard in terms of BNG, in terms of how you might mitigate that impact, because the impact is substantially negative for nature. So yeah, when you start looking at your land banking, you will probably want to prioritize previously developed land, urban land, and less likely any land that's associated with local nature, protected species, and so on and so forth. And that's the earliest point of decision making. Greenfield sites as well typically do have quite a bit of biodiversity involved in them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and do local plans take that into? I mean, have they been taking that into account? That going, well, actually, if we try and develop this brownfield site, it's going to be really tough potentially, because actually there's this biodiversity there.
Well, I think when in the plan making, when local authorities looking at plan making, they do prioritise those locations that have previously been developed, whether they have things like open mosaic habitats in there and so on. They're also looking at sites which developers are bringing forward and lobbying for. I think the question is for developers really is to look at the sites they're thinking about and really factor into what the BNG regs are and how it impacts on them and how it impacts on their cost. Because we know that there's a huge challenge in this country in terms of the cost of development. A part of that is to understand what the risks are associated with green infrastructure. And if you're looking at a couple of sites and weighing it up, and one perhaps has less green infrastructure in there already, or biodiversity, then you may be it may be an easier win to get yourself through planning if you choose those sites first.
Okay, and so what are the other good practice things that we should be that you've been seeing and looking at?
Some of the bigger developers that are building quite phased master plans, that some good practice that came from them really was to consider how you frame BNG in the wider narrative for wider community and existing residents, for local authority officers, but also for the political side. So rather than just reducing BNG to a regulatory requirement, the narrative is about well-designed places, because we've found those developers that do that, they're able to offer a higher value product at the end of it, because the housing is embedded within a much more attractive environment. So it's a win for nature, but also it's a win for the people who would like to live there, and therefore it comes at a premium. We also talk about liaising with local authority planning officers regularly and all the way through the process. And I think local planning authorities have been really good at this, not necessarily having formal discussions all the time that require written commentary, but rather ad hoc conversations about getting on the like we used to do, Chris. We got on the telephone, and we found where people have been having human relationships with each other that respect each other's positions, that things move along much more smoothly.
And that's a much more proactive approach, I guess, is what you're looking for. It's like you can see that the developers heading down a route that which you might regard as suboptimal. Let's just get on the phone, talk to them.
And I think if you've got a planning performance agreement, that's all set out in there, and that would be paid for. So it comes back to the resourcing, because I think some of the listeners maybe say, well, I tried to pick up the phone to the planner, but I couldn't get through, and they're not available, because we know that they're really under the cosh in terms of capacity. So what can you do to help that? So the idea is to, if they do pre-app advice, again, some local authorities do not, but we would definitely encourage them all to do that for BNG, just because it's so helpful to do that, and then have those conversations up front. So then when you put your planning application in, at least those issues that you've dealt with at that stage should hopefully go through relatively easily, without having to have those conversations while you're waiting for planning approval, but get it in early. And also I think the points that Paul was making about the design and integrating it in early, it's just good design generally, is to look at your site and design around what is on your site already. And that comes into things like areas that flood. It comes into things like sustainable urban drainage systems, which are have now come in as a much requirement. If you're trying to pretend that your site is empty and you're just putting things in without designing around what's already there, it's going to be much more difficult just across the board, not just for Biodiversity Net Gain.
I think what we don't have in these reports, Becky, is what does it look like? What the layouts, corridors look like, what the dimensions are for those, just really so officers particularly can understand that the BNG metric isn't a mathematical art. Actually, what it is, it's about place building. And it's about bringing all of those complex elements together in a manner which really, really sings, and they all sing together in harmony.
Definitely. And I think that point about thinking about things together. So, you may have green space standards, green infrastructure here, but you do need to think carefully about that biodiversity net gain and what habitats can be supported. So if you start saying, right, okay, this is going to meet my open space requirements and my BNG, and it's going to be a SUD, is that actually possible? Because, if it's going to flood periodically, does it meet the open space requirements? But also, is it going to actually create that habitat? But if you design, think about that up front and get the ecologists and landscape architects involved early on, there's some really great examples
Yeah.
out there. But we'd like to see more.
Working with landscape architects, working with ecologists, working with tree officers and so on, a lot of the elements they're talking about can be open to interpretation. And we know
Yes.
developers have said, well, I
Yeah.
think with yourself, Grace, engineering background and so on, there's a process, and you kind of run through that process quite rationally and you get to a thing. But I think what we're talking about with green infrastructure, BNG, is something which is a bit more interpretive, and therefore you need to have those conversations and those discussions with the local planning authority, with your team, with your experienced ecologist who's on board, or with the landscape architect that's helping you with the format, to have those debates to get to a point where you've got to the agreed option. I think that's the key thing. It's not just a tick box exercise, is it, Becky?
No, but that does mean there is some flexibility. So although we've got this legal structure in there which sets these, 10% and you've got to do it this way, actually, because of the way that nature works and because of the way you can integrate it in design, it does mean there's flexibility. But again, you can't do that at the last minute. You have to think about that early on in terms of your design, because as soon as you start constraining, potentially by setting a layout at a very early stage, which doesn't take account of perhaps your biodiversity net gain, it becomes difficult.
Yeah, okay. I'm expecting most of the listeners for this podcast are probably going to be developers. I'm aware of the HBF report on biodiversity net gain that came out recently, where 29% of the respondents had said that they found BNG very challenging. I mean, the good news it was down from 38% the previous year. I know a lot of developers are really worried in this space. Can we expect things to get easier, do you think?
Yeah, and I agree it's tough because it's been a real change. With anything where you've got a big change, it just takes time to get used to it. And I think at least we're seeing those figures, that they've gone down quite a lot in just a year in terms of who's finding it, the number that are finding it very challenging. But there's all sorts of really useful resources out there, and I know, I probably just point to Future Homes Hub. They run events, all sorts of things on this, and they have forum, and I think we're learning and we're working together on all of this, which is really, really good. You could see it as a problem, but we definitely see, from an LPA point of view, who we primarily work with, yes, I don't think many people are saying it's easy, but the number who find it very challenging is definitely reducing over time.
Well, I think this is the point in the podcast. I'm feeling in a generous mood, and I want to give you one wish. I don't stretch to 3 wishes. I only do 1 wish. What's the one thing that would make a big difference in this space off the tops of your heads?
I mean, it's something I always say, let's just work more collaboratively across the board. That's developers, LPAs, consultants, and getting to the other sort of side in terms of long-term management companies, habitat banks. Let's not look at each other as one versus the other, developers complaining about LPAs or LPAs to complaining about developers. I think that would be my one wish. Let's work together on this and view it positively. So yeah.
Well, obviously Becky took what I was about to say. So I'll go down my second one, and I guess really it's something that I mentioned earlier on, really, and it's really about realizing that anything around nature, anything around climate change, anything around good homes and so on delivers well-designed places. In delivering well-designed places and homes people want to live in, the demand will be there for your housing, for your products. My experience really is that those developers who've taken that on board are able to sell their units at the end of the day, and ideally for a profit, which is what we're all after, isn't it?
That would always help.
Well, where there's risk, there needs to be profit, Chris, and we don't deny that. And I think we're all here really to smooth that process.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Paul and Becky, for joining me today on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure having this chance to talk to you.
It's been great to be here. Thanks very much.
Hopefully, we're all had a good time and you've enjoyed listening to it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Future Homes podcast, and thank you once again to Becky and Paul for sharing their insights. If you'd like to explore more of the topics we've discussed today, there is practical advice, news and events on the Future Homes Hub website and on our dedicated Knowledge Centre. Make sure to follow or subscribe to Future Homes Podcast wherever you're listening so you don't miss future episodes. More importantly, please physically tell someone about us in the real world or even share this link with them. See you next time.